The human who had stepped out of the portal first seemed to be laughing as he drew tube after tube from his coat, letting it explode in his hand as the chamber began to fill with an acrid smoke that burned Steve's throat and lungs. But even then, he saw an elven woman with pitch-black hair engage Avloria. The possibly Almarin elf lunged and struck trading blows with the legendary fighter, and Steve was sure the Almarin woman would die at least 5 different times, but somehow managed to twist and turn her own curved sword in time to parry each blow. She turned Avloria around as their duel seemed to be perfectly matched with neither able to strike at the other. But then the black-haired elf laughed in the face of the Alsaurian's champion as Steve realized her mistake. Her back was now turned to the rushing humans behind her. She turned to block their attacks, but that opened up her guard, and the black-haired elf struck, driving her blade straight through Avloria's throat. Steve gasped out as he watched the black-haired elf jerk her sword free and then lick the blade clean of blood before turning and jumping into the fray once more as he lost sight of her in the smoke. But all around he saw much of the same happening over and over. The best of the best, the very greatest fighters and legends that Alsaurian had to offer, were being overrun by this mass of ragged fighters who were working together. He then looked forward and realized that Fenrina was in trouble. She was blocking and parrying against Larazit's Loren Nizef. He was ignoring the rest of the fight and seemed to have a very single-minded focus, trying to kill Fenrina and Steve behind her. "Teamwork!" he shouted out then and gripped Sherry's shoulder. "Wait for him to be about to strike, then use your whip." Sherry nodded and waited for Fenrina to get knocked back by a blow to her shield. Then, as Slorin raised his long sword to strike again, she lashed out with her whip, wrapping it around his closer arm as the elf growled and turned to try and pull Sherry closer to loosen the tension. But as he did, it put his sword at the wrong angle to strike and Steve lunged forward. He knew that Slorin was one of, if not the, greatest living swordsmen, but Steve had no plans on dueling him. Instead, he tackled the elf to the ground, wrestling with him as he twisted and turned, getting the swordsman to extend his arm with the sword in it. "Larry!" "Oh, it's hammer time," the dwarf said as he stepped forth and brought his hammer down on the elf's extended hand. Up this close, Steve could hear the crunch just before Slorin screamed in his ear, and he couldn't really hear anything else. He pressed down on the pinned swordsman then as he grinned, figuring the elf was out of the fight. But to his surprise, Fenrina's sword came down right before him as she buried it in the elf's face. Steve turned away as the blood and flesh squirted up. He was about to yell at her, but then saw that she was already turning to block an attack from one of the elite Alsaurian guard who was still alive. Steve had nearly forgotten there was still a fight going on around him and rolled off of the dead elf as he got back into it. This time the others didn't need any input from him, as Fenrina blocked another strike, and Sherry lashed out with her whip, yanking the elf's foot out from under him to make him kneel down hard, which gave Larry an opening to step up swinging. Larry smashed his hammer into the elf's helmet, cracking it hard, but even as he fell, Fenrina stepped forward, stabbing down through the gap between the soldier's helmet and his shoulder straight down through his neck into his heart. By now, the smoke had almost completely filled the chamber, and Steve could barely see, his eyes burning and stinging, but he noticed one more figure ahead of him through the fog, easy to spot because of the fire she was tossing around. Saliava. He left another of the soldiers to the other 3 as he rushed forward, trying to stay low as he slid behind a table to dodge a fireball that flew past his head, and then glanced over the top to see where she was looking. When she was facing away from him, he rose up and sprinted straight forward, figuring he might as well use his tried and tested method once again. However, this time as he jumped to tackle her, he instead bounced off and was sent flying back into the table he'd just used for cover. Steve slammed into the table, knocking it over as he cried in pain, his back hitting the edge hard. Gripping the edge of the table for support, he started to get up only to see Saliava standing above him. There was a maniacal gleam in her eyes as electricity crackled between her hands, and she hit Steve with the second strongest lightning bolt he'd ever experienced. But instead of being fried to a crisp like she expected, he just smiled as she watched his belt glow, and then a burst of electricity shot back at her, making her twitch and dance before collapsing to the ground. Lunging forward, Steve pinned her to the ground and was about to try and grab her hands to keep her from casting when she let out one of the most sensual moans he'd ever heard. In that brief moment of confusion, as his brain tried to fight some very primal instincts, he nearly missed the dagger in her hand. He gasped and caught her wrist just as she was about to drive the blade into his throat, and he grunted, actually straining hard to push the blade back. She had the foresight to magically enhance her strength for the fight, while he'd been too distracted to think about it until now. He gasped and grunted harder as he pulled his head back, slowly feeling the blade start to press against his throat as he struggled to keep it back. "Hey! No one hurts my man!" Just as he heard that, Sherry stepped out of the fog, kicking the sorceress in the head, smacking it down against the hard stone beneath her. As her head cracked against the stone, she quickly went limp, and Steve tumbled over suddenly, no longer having anything stopping the force he was pushing into her arm. "Thanks, honey," he said, but wasn't all that sure he could be heard since his voice sounded distant. He sat up then and looked around as Fenrina and Larry stepped through the smoke as well. Fenrina reached down to pull him up to his feet, and he desperately opened his mouth a few times as he tried to get his ears to work right once more. Nga, is it over?" he asked as he no longer heard any more explosions. "Right, we got 'em all, lads. Take their dead and ours back to the ship so's we can loot 'em proper." He heard the voice echo out even with his impaired hearing, and before he could really do anything about it, he saw more humans move through the smoke and pick up virtually everything they could. Bodies, books, everything that was on the tables. Hell, he even saw a few pick up one of the tables and quickly drag it back through the portal. The group backed up, then not wishing to get in the way of the fighters that he had summoned, and before he knew it, the smoke was fading and the portal was gone, along with almost everything else in the room. Almost. He looked over to see the stone altar was still there, and the gem inside it that Afrosia had used to focus her magic. The professor was lying beside it, groaning as she clutched at her stomach. Steve and the others approached her as he watched the elf try and sit up, but she hissed in pain as the wound to her stomach seemed to be fairly severe. Those are your champions," she coughed out. "This planet is doomed." "Fuck you," Steve said simply as he looked down at her. "Well, you have your victory. Kill me, and be done with it." She gasped out, seeming to have trouble breathing. "Fuck you," he repeated. "Larry, heal her up." Now, Larry Love does enjoy bringing the glory of the goddess of love to the ladies. "But are you sure?" the dwarf asked. "Yeah, what the fuck? She tried to unmake us," Sherry added. "She's beat. Let the council decide her fate. Maybe something can be salvaged from all this." He quickly reached down, slapping Afrosia's hand away from a vial she was trying to pull out of her robes. "Ah! No taking the easy way out!" The elf let out a frustrated scream and then coughed up some blood. But Steve ignored that as he reached into her robe's left pocket and pulled free a scroll. "Is that?" Sherry trailed off as she saw the scroll. "This is it. Time travel." He opened it up and began to read through it before letting out a sigh and rolling it back up, tucking it into a pocket. "So, we won, right?" Fenrina asked as Larry began to use his holy blessings to heal Afrosia's wound. "Sort of. We still need to get that. And her. Out of here." He pointed to the altar and Afroisa. "We have no idea how the battle went outside either. Sherry, you tie her up since I know you're good with knots. Fenrina and I will… Fenrina and Larry will carry the altar. I'll get Afrosia. Or, is it better if Larry and I get the altar and Fenrina gets Afrosia?" He muttered out loud. "You get the elf. I'll get the altar," Fenrina said then as she slipped her shield onto her back and growled as she picked up the altar and the gem all at once. "We'll catch up," Steve said with a nod, and let Larry and Fenrina head out as he waited for Sherry to finish tying up Afrosia. "You know we could just kill her now," Sherry mentioned, but Steve just shook his head. "She's tied up and beaten. Not my style. Besides, I highly doubt the Archon will let her live anyway." Afrosia growled and struggled as he said that, but it wasn't like she could do a thing about it thanks to Sherry's extensive skills with tying knots. Once secure, Steve hauled the elf up over his shoulders and followed after Sherry. The difference in the catacombs was immediately noticeable as they caught up with Fenrina. The halls were quiet. The candles were burnt out. None of them changed suddenly in age. When they got back to the surface, the leaves on the tree were green, and the echo of the wedding party didn't show up again. Thankfully, their trip back through the sewers was uneventful, and aside from Steve dropping Afrosia a few times to get her to stop struggling so much, it was quiet as well. Once they were out in the open fields, Steve was pretty tired from carrying the prisoner, but he pushed himself forward, keeping pace with the others. In the distance, he realized he heard the rumble from before. The battle must still be going on. He wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not, but at the very least it meant that the Almarans hadn't lost. He was wondering about how far they'd have to go when he saw the Archon ahead of them in the trees, and the rest of the council was behind her. "You're not at the battle?" he asked as he got close and dropped Afrosia to the ground. He ignored her muffled protest from being dropped so hard, but he was a bit too sore and tired to care. "We will return shortly, but this is important. Is this it?" the Archon asked as she set a hand on the altar. "It's some sort of, I don't know, a focus point? It holds time in check around it so one can use the magic." Steve shrugged. She knows more. He gave the squirming elf a nudge with his foot. "And the scroll?" she asked. Steve reached into his pocket and then handed it over. "Stephen, did you read it?" He looked up into the swirling galaxies that were her eyes and nodded. Yeah, I did," he admitted. "Then we must expunge it from your memory," Evelina said as he stepped out from the rest of the council. "That spell is dangerous," Arch-Sorcerer Duskmaw mentioned. "We're not even sure it has to be done yet," Arch-Chair Tyrinia also protested. "It's too dangerous for anyone to know," Evelina stressed. "Fair, that's fair. If you really think it's necessary, I'll submit to it. But you can decide once I come back," Steve said. "Come back from where?" Evelina asked, and then pointed. "No, don't you dare. Archon, stop him. Please, just trust me," Steve said as he looked up at the Archon still. She watched him for a moment, and then nodded, just as he touched the stone. It was a very pleasant night in Arbitus, or a very early morning. Either way, it wasn't too hot nor too cold. Steve took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air and looked out the window of his apartment in the academy with a smile. He looked around a moment and then grinned wider. "The last piece of cake! Ooh, I'm gonna enjoy this!" He sat down at the little table in his room with a soft groan of relief as his legs were tired and simply picked up the last piece of the legendary Cake of Doom, not bothering with any utensils as he ate it bit by bit, forcing himself to take small bites as he groaned and savored the taste. Once he was done, he licked the frosting from his hand and turned around to look at himself asleep on the bed. Okay. Let's get this over with. Hey, asshole, wake up. He stepped over to himself, trying to shake himself awake. But in his sleep, he just groaned and waved himself off. Damn it. I guess this part was necessary. He reached under the bed then, and pulled out the pot which he upended on his sleeping self. "What? Who saw what? What did—" The now wet Steve sat up in bed looking around as he tried to wake up and figure out what was going on. "Oh, that was my own piss! What the fuck?" Now that Steve had Steve's attention, he slapped the startled and wet mage across the face. "Hey, asshole! Wake up and pay attention. I just ate the last piece of cake. How do you like that?" he asked as he shook himself a bit. "What? You asshole? What the fuck?" Steve tried to struggle, but in his grogginess couldn't really muster the strength to fight properly. Yeah, I ate it all, and the only way to stop me is to travel through time. How you like that, shithead?" He laughed in his own face. "I'll kick your ass for this," he yelled back angrily. "We have the same ass fucknugget. I'm you, but from the future. So if you want stop me, you have to go prevent Professor Afrosia in the Magistone Fortress from completing her time travel magic that will undo all of humanity and Almera." Once he had said all of that, he just sat there looking confused. "Wait, if I'm me, why am I attacking myself?" he asked. "I don't know. It's how I woke myself up. Not like I'm going to let you off the hook. If I made me suffer through it, then you know you'd make you suffer through it too," he explained. "Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Professor Afrosia, Magistone Fortress, right? Me? That's the spirit. Don't forget to make us look good in front of the Archon. Oh, and take a shower." He stepped back from the bed, and then took a bigger step back through the portal. "Where did you go? Steve, what did you do?" Evelinus was yelling at him. "What I already did! How do you think I found out about all of this?" "Sheesh!" Steve waved the elf off. "You had the ability to travel through time, to do anything, and all you did was warn yourself?" the Archon asked. "Yeah, I think it's one of those, things where something has to happen a certain way for it all to work out," he said. "Fate?" Duskmaw asked. "No! Fuck fate! I hate fate! Fate is for chumps who believe in the goddess of fate, and fuck her!" Steve shouted. "I don't know! Something about time travel! Fuck, I hate messing with time! It's all so fucking complicated!" He tossed his hands up and stomped off. "There's a battle still going on! We don't have time to sit around! We need to get back to work! But whatever it wasn't fate! None of that!" As Steve marched off, the Archon disappeared the altar and let the others carrying Afrosia with them as they headed back to the battle with Steve. The battle was a close thing. But in the end, the Almarins prevailed. Deprived of their superior archers and magic, the Alsorians had to engage the legions in a mass infantry battle for which the Almarins had dedicated their lives to mastering. Though the Alsorian elite hit the Almarin center hard and the lines began to give way, this just let the more elite Almarin flanks push forward, and an hour after Steve and the Council rejoined the fight, the Almarins managed to encircle a numerically superior force, a feat not easily accomplished. By staying at the center, Consul Gary inspired his men to never give against the superior Alsorian, and his Praetorians had a much easier time against the inferior Alsorian flanks. Then, aided by the orcs and their wargs who circled around the back, their victory was accomplished. The elves had nowhere to go, and their choices quickly became surrender or die. Many historians would later speculate on the decisions of the Alsorians to break the siege, and despite number of people involved, Afrosia's experiment was never brought to light. Nor was her fate. Officially, she worked for Orbitus for another century, no longer teaching but being assigned to some secretive lab deep within the academy. Many weren't even aware she still worked there before perishing in a magic accident just before her retirement. Her body was never recovered. Historians also speculate on just why the consul called for a surprisingly lenient surrender of the city. Almarins were not known for mercy in their conquests, and many a city were littered with grisly reminders of what happened to those who defied them. However, for Magistone, the city was occupied without any further fighting. The citizens were left alone, and those that could pay for it were able to secure the ransom of their captive relatives among the soldiers who had survived the battle. Many wild conspiracies circulated that this was the cost of securing the help of mysterious and powerful allies before the battle. But the more historically accepted answer is that the consul wanted to set a new precedent for what would become his conquest of all of Alsoriene, and not just a single city, a conquest that the Senate wasn't sure it had authorized, and which became a tricky bit of Almarin politics. Steve, of course, was vilified by most of the rest of the world for his hand in teaching Almarin's unsanctioned magic. He was banned from all elven kingdoms, most dwarven nations, and even most human ones, though it was likely because they were envious of the Almarin's new military advantage more than anything. Orbitus's official response was that the matter would be handled internally, and before long other human nations suddenly learned a few spells of their own. Though the human mages Riava and Karistan were cleared of any wrongdoing, Steve didn't mind being vilified, however. He'd saved the world, and just because no one knew that didn't make it any less true. What hurt him was having to sit by and watch for a while after. The Archon couldn't use him and Doom for a bit, until things had blown over and the war quickly grew as he was forced to do nothing. Until finally one day, he was given a task that would end the war and bring peace across the land once more. But that is a story for another time.